What happens when your fairy tale life turns into your worst nightmare overnight? For Amelia Hayes, she had it all: a sprawling home in the Hollywood Hills, a loving marriage to billionaire tech mogul Richard Sterling, and their first child on the way. She was living a dream. But one rainy Tuesday, that dream was shattered by a fatal car crash. And as Amelia was drowning in grief, she was about to be drowned by the ultimate betrayal. At the reading of her husband's will, she discovered his entire $500 million fortune wasn't left to her or their unborn child, but to a woman she had never even heard of. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story of a pregnant, widowed wife who, with nothing left to lose, decided to fight back against a ghost, a mistress, and a legal system designed to crush her. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking twists and turns of a battle that proves hell hath no fury like a woman scorned and a mother protecting her child. The silence was the worst part. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that had fallen over the 10,000-square-foot Beverly Hills estate. Just 3 days ago, this house had been filled with the resonant baritone of her husband Richard Sterling as he debated stock prices on the phone, the clinking of ice in his evening whiskey, and the soft, hopeful plans they'd make for the nursery in the East Wing. Now the silence was broken only by Amelia Hayes's own ragged breaths and the sympathetic yet useless ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Richard was gone. A rain-slicked stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway, a misjudged corner, and a head-on collision had erased the brilliant, charismatic, and infuriating man she loved from the world. At 34, Amelia was a widow. At 7 months pregnant, she was about to be a single mother. Her hand rested instinctively on the swell of her belly, a gesture that had become her only anchor in a world thrown off its axis. Their son. They'd been so excited. Richard, who had conquered the tech world with his company Nexus Dynamics, had been childlike in his glee, already buying miniature bespoke suits and tiny driving shoes. "He's a Sterling," he'd boom. "He needs to look the part." Amelia had laughed her own background as a successful architect, feeling quaint next to his larger-than-life persona. They had met at a charity gala 5 years ago. She was there overseeing the event design. He was the keynote speaker. He had pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a hostile takeover, and she, despite her initial reservations about his flashy lifestyle, had fallen for the sharp mind and surprisingly tender heart beneath the billionaire armor. The first few days after the crash were a blur of condolences, casseroles from neighbors she barely knew, and the hollow-eyed pity of friends. Her sister Chloe had flown in from Chicago and moved into a guest room, becoming a silent, efficient sentinel who managed phone calls and ensured Amelia remembered to eat. The call for the reading of the will came a week after the funeral. It felt brutally fast, a cold administrative necessity trampling on the sacred ground of her grief. Richard's longtime lawyer, a stoic man named Arthur Vance, had requested her presence at his downtown LA office. "Is this really necessary right now?" "Arthur," Amelia had asked, her voice raspy. "It is, Amelia. Richard's estate is complex. There are business provisions in the will that must be addressed immediately to ensure the stability of Nexus Dynamics. I'm very sorry." So she went. Dressed in a simple black maternity dress that felt like a costume, she sat in a leather chair that smelled of old books and money. Arthur's office was on the 40th floor, with a panoramic view of a city that now felt alien and hostile. David Chen, Richard's business partner and best friend, was also there, his face pale and drawn. He gave her a weak, apologetic smile. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the document. The legalese washed over Amelia Trust's stock options holding companies. She expected the bulk of it to be a formality. Richard had always been clear, "Everything I have is for you and for him," he'd say, patting her stomach. Their future and their son's future was secure. That was the one cold comfort in this whole tragedy. Arthur read through clauses about a few charitable donations and a generous provision for his aging mother. Then he paused, took a sip of water and looked at Amelia over the rim of his glasses. His expression was one she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to dread. And now Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, "We come to the residuary estate. This clause, dated 6 months ago, supersedes all previous versions." He took a deep breath. "I, Richard Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my remaining personal and professional assets, including all properties, liquid capital, and my controlling shares in Nexus Dynamics, to Ms. Isabella Rossi." The name hung in the air, a foreign object with no meaning. Isabella Rossi. Amelia looked at Arthur, expecting a correction. A typo. A joke in the worst possible taste. "I'm sorry," Amelia said, a faint, nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Who?" David Chen flinched beside her, looking down at his clasped hands as if they held the secrets of the universe. That was the first alarm bell. David knew the name. Arthur Vance's face was grim. "Isabella Rossi," he repeated as if speaking to a child. He pushed a smaller document across the polished mahogany desk. It was a single sheet of paper with a name and address in Soho, New York, and a social security number. Amelia's mind was a frantic buzzing blank. She searched her memory for any mention of this woman. A business associate? A distant cousin? Nothing. The name was a void. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There must be a mistake. Our son? What about our son Richard would never—" Arthur's gaze softened, but his words were like shards of glass. "Amelia, the will is legally ironclad. It was signed, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized. Richard was declared to be of sound mind. According to this document, his entire fortune, estimated at over $500 million, belongs to Ms. Rossi." The room began to spin. The panoramic view of the city tilted violently. $500 million. Everything. The house she was living in. The money for her baby's future. The company Richard had built from nothing. All of it was gone, handed to a stranger. A cold, creeping dread far worse than grief began to seep into her bones. Grief was the pain of loss. This was the horror of erasure. It was as if her entire 5-year marriage, the life they had built, the child she was carrying, had been wiped away by a signature on a piece of paper. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her eyes locked on David Chen. "David," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Who is she?" David couldn't meet her gaze. He just shook his head, his silence a deafening confession. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Richard hadn't just died. He had systematically, secretly, and deliberately disinherited her and their unborn child. And his best friend had known. The silence that had haunted her home for a week suddenly had a name. It was the sound of a secret life, a life that had just detonated her own. The storm of grief was over. The war was just beginning. The drive back to Beverly Hills was a silent movie of Amelia's life crumbling. The sun-drenched palms and designer storefronts of Rodeo Drive seemed to mock her artifacts from a life that was no longer hers. Chloe was waiting on the marble steps of the house, Isabella Rossi's house. A cruel voice in her head corrected, and knew from one look at Amelia's face that something was terribly wrong. Inside, the story tumbled out a torrent of disbelief and pain. Chloe listened, her expression hardening from sympathy to outrage. "A mistake. It has to be a mistake," Chloe insisted, pacing the vast living room. "Blackmail, coercion. There's no way Richard would do this." But Amelia had seen David Chen's face. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was no mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate, calculated demolition of their life together. That night's sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind, an architect's mind trained to see blueprints and structures, was now obsessed with deconstructing her husband's secret life. Armed with a glass of milk and Richard's laptop, which his assistant had dropped off, she began to dig. His password was, with a sickening irony, their anniversary. 0514. For a moment she felt a flicker of hope. A man who used their anniversary as a password couldn't be a monster. The hope died a quick and brutal death. There was nothing obvious in his primary email account. It was all business Nexus Dynamics board meetings and a few emails to her with flight confirmations for their baby moon to Italy, a trip they would never take. But Richard was a creature of habit and redundancy. He had backups for his backups. Amelia found a link to a cloud storage account buried in a subfolder labeled Personal Ventures. The password for this was different. She tried his birthday, his mother's birthday, the company's founding date. Nothing. On a whim, her fingers typed Isabella. Access granted. The contents of the folder were a digital stab to the heart. It wasn't just an affair. It was a parallel life. There were hundreds of photos. Richard and a stunningly beautiful woman with raven black hair and piercing green eyes. They were in Paris, laughing under the Eiffel Tower. On a yacht in Monaco, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. In a cozy New York apartment decorated with expensive modern art, looking every bit the established couple. This was Isabella Rossi. The dates on the photos stretched back 3 years. 3 years of lies. He had been with this woman a year before he'd even proposed to Amelia. He had proposed to her, looked her in the eyes, and promised her forever, all while living this other life. Then she found the financial records. A folder simply labeled IR contained a litany of devastation. A wire transfer for $2.5 million, the down payment for an art gallery in Soho. Monthly credit card statements for a card Amelia never knew existed, with charges from Cartier, Chanel, and five-star hotels around the world. He hadn't just been having an affair, he had been funding an entire existence for this woman. The final document was a PDF scan, a preliminary draft of the will she'd heard read just hours ago. The date on it was from 8 months back, just a week after Amelia had tearfully told him she was pregnant. The timing was a calculated cruelty that made her physically ill. He had learned he was going to be a father, and in response, he had written his son out of his life. The next morning, Amelia wasn't just grieving. She was cold with a fury so profound it felt like a new source of energy. Grief made you weak. Rage made you focused. She called David Chin. "We need to talk," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "My house. 1 hour." He arrived looking like he hadn't slept. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, refusing to sit. "Why, David?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" He finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and pity. "I didn't know the extent of it, Amelia. I swear. I knew about Isabella. Richard called her his escape. He said things with you were perfect, almost too perfect. He felt he couldn't be his real messy self. He said Isabella. She understood his demons. His demons." Amelia's voice dripped with scorn. "His demons drove a Porsche and shopped on Fifth Avenue." "He was going to tell you," David stammered. "After the baby was born, he was torn. He loved you, Amelia. He really did. But he was addicted to her, to the life he had with her. The will. I had no idea about the will. That's a shock to me, too. It's insane. It's not the Richard I knew. The Richard you knew was a liar," she stated flatly. "And you enabled him." She dismissed him with a wave of her hand, the friendship they had shared now just another piece of wreckage. Her path was clear. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about the fact that Richard's son would not be born into a world where his own father had declared him worthless. She remembered the lawyer who had handled her prenuptial agreement with Richard, a savvy, no-nonsense woman who had warned her in a gentle but firm way about the power imbalances in the relationship. A woman Richard had dismissed as an overly aggressive shark. That was exactly the kind of shark Amelia needed now. She found the card in her old file cabinet. Eleanor Vance and Associates, specializing in high-stakes family law and estate litigation. Arthur Vance's daughter. The irony was not lost on her. When she called, she got Eleanor's assistant. "Ms. Vance is booked for the next 3 months. Tell her it's Amelia Hayes." The widow of Richard Sterling. Amelia said, a new hardness in her tone. Tell her I'm about to be evicted from my home by a ghost, and I'm 7 months pregnant with a disinherited baby. I'm quite sure she'll find the time." Eleanor Vance called back in 10 minutes. The meeting was set for the next day. As Amelia hung up the phone, she walked over to the grand window overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens. The gardeners were still tending to the roses Richard had planted for her. Soon they would be taking orders from Isabella Rossi. Amelia placed a hand on her belly. "He won't erase you," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I won't let him." Eleanor Vance's office was the antithesis of her father's. Where Arthur's was old-world wood-paneled and masculine, Eleanor's was stark modern and radiating sharp feminine power. Glass walls, chrome furniture, and a single dramatic orchid on a white desk. Eleanor herself was in her early 40s with a severe blonde bob and eyes that seemed to analyze, categorize, and dismiss you all in the space of a single handshake. Amelia laid out the story, pushing the printouts from Richard's secret cloud account across the desk. The photos, the bank statements, the draft of the will. She spoke with a detached clinical precision, having walled off her emotions for the sake of clarity. Eleanor listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. When Amelia was finished, she was silent for a full minute. "Your husband was a very methodical man," Eleanor said finally, her voice crisp. "And a very thorough bastard. Forgive my French." "Can I fight this?" Amelia asked, the question hanging in the air. "You can always fight," Eleanor corrected. "The question is, can you win? On the surface, the will is sound. He was of age, he signed it, it was witnessed. His mental state would be the primary angle of attack. We would have to prove one of two things. Either he lacked testamentary capacity, meaning he was not of sound mind when he signed it, or he was under undue influence. He wasn't insane, Eleanor. He was running a multi-billion-dollar company." "I'm not talking about insanity," Eleanor clarified, leaning forward. "I'm talking about a state of mind so compromised that he was not acting of his own free will." "Was he ill?" "On any heavy medication." "Showing signs of cognitive decline?" Amelia thought back. In the last year, Richard had been more volatile, more secretive. He'd had bouts of intense paranoia about corporate espionage and had been drinking more heavily, but enough to invalidate a will. It seemed like a stretch. "That leaves undue influence," Eleanor continued. "We have to prove that this Isabella Rossi exerted a level of psychological control over him that essentially subverted his own intentions and replaced them with hers. We have to paint her as a predator, a manipulator who isolated him and coerced him into this decision. She's the one he left his entire fortune to, abandoning his pregnant wife. Doesn't that speak for itself?" Amelia asked, a note of frustration in her voice. "To you, yes. To a judge, it's just a man changing his mind. Rich, powerful men have mistresses. It's a tale as old as time. The courts are unsympathetic unless we can prove malicious predatory intent." A letter arrived 2 days later. It was from a prestigious law firm, Thorne & Associates, representing the executor of the estate of Richard Sterling and its sole beneficiary, Ms. Isabella Rossi. It was a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. Tucked inside was a second envelope. This one was personal, handwritten on thick, cream-colored cardstock. "Dear Amelia," the note began, the handwriting an elegant looping script. "I cannot begin to imagine the pain you are feeling right now. I know this must be a terrible shock. Richard spoke of you with great respect, and he never intended to cause you hurt. What he and I shared was something separate, something he felt he needed. He was a complex man, and he made this decision for reasons I hope you can one day understand. To that end, my lawyers have drafted a settlement offer. It is my hope that this will provide for you and the child and allow us all to move on without a painful and public conflict. I wish you nothing but the best. Sincerely, Isabella Rossi." The attached settlement offered a one-time payment of $5 million. In exchange, Amelia would waive all future claims to the estate and agree to a non-disclosure agreement. $5 million, Amelia spat, tossing the letter onto Eleanor's desk. It's a rounding error for an estate this size. It's an insult. It's not an insult, Amelia. It's a strategic move, Eleanor countered, picking up the letter. It's a very smart one, actually. It paints her as reasonable, even generous. If we refuse and go to court, her lawyers will use this. They'll say, "We tried to provide for the grieving widow, Your Honor, but she was greedy. She wanted it all." This is her first move in the chess game. So what's our move? We file an immediate challenge to the will. We file for an injunction to stop the eviction and freeze the estate's assets. And Eleanor paused, her eyes gleaming. We arrange a meeting. I want to see this woman. I want to look her in the eye and see who we are dealing with. The meeting took place a week later in a neutral location, a private conference room at a luxury hotel. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked in. Eleanor was a calming presence beside her, radiating an icy confidence. Isabella Rossi was already seated. She was even more beautiful in person than in the photographs. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored navy blue dress with her dark hair pulled back in a chic chignon, she looked less like a homewrecker and more like a CEO. Beside her sat her lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, who had the predatory smile of a shark. Isabella stood as they entered, her expression one of deep, practiced sorrow. "Amelia," she said, her voice soft and cultured. "Thank you for coming. I am so terribly sorry for your loss. For our loss." The "our" was a deliberate, calculated jab. Amelia felt a hot flash of rage but kept her expression neutral, just as Eleanor had coached her. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," Eleanor said, taking a seat. "My client has received your offer. We are rejecting it." Marcus Thorne chuckled. "Ms. Vance, with all due respect, on what grounds you have a legally binding will and testament? Your client has a prenuptial agreement that, while generous, doesn't entitle her to the primary estate. Your case is based on emotion, not law. My case is based on the fact that Mr. Sterling, a man who was famously devoted to building a legacy, inexplicably disinherited his only son and heir. Just weeks after learning of his existence," Eleanor shot back. "We find that highly suspect. We find it indicative of undue influence." Isabella finally spoke, her gaze fixed on Amelia. Her green eyes were filled with what looked like genuine empathy, a performance so convincing it was terrifying. "This wasn't about money, Amelia." Richard felt trapped. He felt he was playing a role with you, the perfect husband, the perfect father-to-be. With me, he could just be himself. He left me his fortune because he knew I understood his true legacy, his soul. It was a testament to our connection, not an attack on you. Every word was a perfectly crafted insult, painting Amelia as a naive placeholder in Richard's real life. "His soul," Amelia said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "You knew he had a wife. You knew he had a child on the way. And you took everything. You call that understanding his soul, I call it a heist." Isabella's mask of sympathy flickered for a brief second. A flicker of something cold and hard flashed in her eyes before she replaced it with a wounded look. "I'm sorry you see it that way," she murmured. "We were trying to handle this with dignity." "Dignity," Marcus Thorne interjected, closing his briefcase with a sharp snap, "is accepting the generous offer on the table. The alternative is a very public, very ugly court battle where your and Mr. Sterling's private lives will be dissected in excruciating detail. I have to ask you, Ms. Hayes, is that something you want to put yourself and your unborn child through? I suggest you reconsider." It was a threat cloaked in legal concern. They were banking on her being too pregnant, too grieving, and too intimidated to fight. They were counting on her to take the money and disappear. As they walked out of the hotel, Amelia felt a tremor of fear. Thorne was right. A court battle would be brutal. They would try to tear her apart on the stand. "She's good," Eleanor said, her voice grim as they waited for the valet. "She's playing the part of the tragic soulmate perfectly. Thorne is a viper. They think they have this won." "Do they?" Amelia asked, her voice small. Eleanor looked at her, a fierce light in her eyes. They have a signed document. We have a story of a predatory mistress and a compromised man. Right now it's a coin toss. Our job is to find the evidence that proves our story is the true one. We need to dig into Isabella Rossi's life. We need to find out who she really was before she became Richard's soulmate. Because women like that, they almost always have a past. The battle for the estate began not in a courtroom, but in the shadowy world of private investigation. While Eleanor's legal team filed motions and injunctions buying Amelia precious time in her home, a man named Frank Miller was tasked with excavating Isabella Rossi's life. Frank was a former NYPD detective with a bloodhound's nose for secrets and a demeanor that could coax stories out of stones. His first reports were frustratingly thin. Isabella Rossi, 38, had no criminal record. She'd immigrated from Italy with her family as a child. She had a degree in art history from Columbia University. For years, she worked at various high-end galleries in Manhattan before opening her own Galleria Rossi in Soho, the one Richard had funded. On paper, she was the embodiment of the American dream, a smart, cultured, self-made woman. She's clean, Eleanor, Frank reported a week into the investigation. Her financials were a little shaky before she met Sterling, some credit card debt and a business loan she was struggling with, but nothing that screams master criminal. She's just lucky, I guess. No one's that lucky, Frank, Eleanor insisted. Keep digging. Talk to people. Ex-boyfriends, former colleagues, estranged family. Someone knows something. Meanwhile, Amelia was engaged in her own form of archaeology, sifting through the remnants of her marriage. She went through Richard's old journals, his photo albums, his correspondence, looking for any sign of the man who could do this. She found notes about his insecurities, his fear of not living up to his own father's legacy, a profound loneliness that success seemed to amplify rather than cure. It was the messy self David Chen had talked about. Isabella hadn't created these vulnerabilities. She had found them and exploited them. The first crack in Isabella's pristine facade came from an unexpected source. Frank tracked down a disgruntled former curator from Galleria Rossi, a woman named Clara who had been fired 6 months prior. Clara was initially hesitant to talk, bound by an NDA, but Frank's particular brand of persuasive charm and the implication that her silence could be seen as complicity in a major fraud case loosened her tongue. Isabella is a chameleon, Clara said, nursing a coffee in a dingy Brooklyn diner. She becomes whatever the person across from her wants her to be, especially if that person is a man with a 9-figure net worth. Richard Sterling wasn't her first. The air in the diner suddenly felt charged. "What do you mean?" Frank pressed. About 5 years before she met Richard, there was another one, a real estate tycoon named Julian Croft. Older, recently divorced, incredibly wealthy. She met him at a Christie's auction. Within 6 months, she was living in his Park Avenue penthouse. He doted on her, bought her art, introduced her to everyone. She was his entire world. "What happened to him?" Frank asked. Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He died. A heart attack, they said. He was in his late 60s, so no one looked twice. But it was sudden. He'd just had a full physical and been given a clean bill of health. And the timing was convenient." Frank's pulse quickened. "Convenient how?" He'd just added her to his will. Not for everything like with Sterling, but for a modest sum, $10 million. Enough for her to leave the gallery she was at and start planning for her own. But the money got tied up in a fight with his kids. By the time she got it, most of it was gone to legal fees. She learned a lesson from that, I think. She learned to aim for the whole damn thing and make it ironclad. This was it, a pattern of behavior. It was the leverage they needed to argue that Isabella wasn't a passive lover, but an active predator with a history. Frank spent the next week digging into the life and death of Julian Croft. The official cause of death was a massive coronary thrombosis. There was no autopsy performed as his family doctor signed the death certificate. It was a dead end, but a tantalizing one. It might not be admissible in court, but it told them exactly who Isabella was. Back in Los Angeles, Amelia received an unwelcome visitor. Margaret Sterling, Richard's mother, appeared at her doorstep unannounced. Margaret was a formidable woman, an old money matriarch, who had always treated Amelia with a polite but cool distance. She believed Amelia was a perfectly suitable wife, but not the society-bred woman she had envisioned for her brilliant son. "Amelia," she said, her tone brisk as she stepped into the foyer. "We need to talk about this circus you are creating." She sat in the formal living room, refusing any offer of tea or water. "I have read the letters from Richard's lawyers. I have read about your lawsuit. You are dragging the Sterling name through the mud. Richard made his wishes clear. For you to contest them is unseemly." Amelia, her belly now a prominent curve under her sweater, felt a surge of defiance. "Unseemly? Your son disinherited his own child, Margaret. He left everything he had to a woman he was having an affair with for 3 years, and you are worried about appearances." "Richard was a complicated man," Margaret said, her voice unwavering. "He clearly felt a profound connection with this woman. Perhaps she understood him in a way you did not. He made a choice. Your choice now is to accept it with grace, or to create a public spectacle that will only tarnish his memory and hurt your child in the long run." The conversation was a brutal reminder of the world they were up against. A world where a man's last wishes, no matter how cruel, were seen as sacrosanct, and the woman left behind was expected to grieve quietly and accept her fate. Margaret saw Isabella not as a threat, but as the fulfillment of a romantic if tragic narrative. "I am not tarnishing his memory," Amelia said, her voice low and steady. "I am protecting his son. The son you are apparently willing to see cast aside. This is my house, Margaret. If you've come here to tell me to give up, you can leave." The encounter left Amelia shaken but also strangely resolved. The battle lines were clearer than ever. On one side was money, power, and a carefully constructed narrative. On her side was the simple, undeniable truth of a mother's instinct. A few days later, Eleanor called with news. "Frank found something. It's not the smoking gun, but it's a very interesting bullet. Remember Clara, the ex-curator? She kept some things from her time at the gallery. Voicemails she saved to protect herself after Isabella fired her." "And," Amelia pressed, her heart pounding, "there's one in particular. It's a message Isabella left for a friend in Italy right after Julian Croft died. She's upset, but not because she's grieving. She's furious that his kids are challenging the will. Listen to this line. Frank transcribed it for me. He promised me security, the old fool. I played my part perfectly for 2 years, and his greedy children want to steal it away. I won't make that mistake again. Next time I'll make sure it's all locked down before the idiot even gets a cold." Amelia sank into a chair, the words echoing in the silent room. "I won't make that mistake again." Richard hadn't just been a lover. He had been her second chance, her do-over, her masterpiece of manipulation. "Is it enough?" Amelia whispered. "It's enough to get us in the ring." Eleanor's voice was grimly determined. "It proves intent. It proves a pattern. Now we just have to convince a judge that Richard Sterling wasn't a man in love. He was the next idiot in her collection." The Superior Court of California County of Los Angeles was an imposing building, a modern temple of justice where lives were dismantled and rebuilt daily. As Amelia walked up the steps, 7.5 months pregnant, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. The story had been leaked to the press, and the media had descended like vultures. "Billionaire's secret will," screamed one headline. "Pregnant widow versus the other woman," read another. They had turned her tragedy into a salacious soap opera. Inside courtroom 14B was packed. On one side, Amelia sat with Eleanor, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed forward. On the other, Isabella and Marcus Thorne were a picture of cool confidence. Isabella was dressed in a conservative charcoal suit, her expression one of pained reluctance, as if this whole affair was a distasteful duty she was forced to endure. The trial began with opening statements. Marcus Thorne went first. He was a master orator, his voice resonating through the courtroom. He painted a picture of Richard Sterling as a tortured genius, a man who had the world at his feet but felt profoundly alone. He described Amelia as a good wife, but one who was part of the gilded cage Richard longed to escape. And then he met Isabella Rossi, Thorne declared, gesturing towards his client. A woman who saw not the billionaire but the man, an intellectual equal, a kindred spirit. Their love was not a sordid affair, ladies and gentlemen. It was a meeting of souls. Richard Sterling's final will was not an act of malice. It was his final act of love, a testament to the woman who truly knew him. Ms. Hayes's prenuptial agreement provided for her generously. This lawsuit is not born of need. It is born of greed and spite. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She walked slowly to the lectern, her presence commanding a different kind of attention, not theatrical, but intensely focused. Marcus Thorne would have you believe this is a love story. She began, her voice calm and clear. It is not. This is a story of predation. It is the story of a calculating woman who targeted a vulnerable married man. A woman with a history of seducing wealthy men for financial gain. A woman who, by her own admission, sees men not as partners, but as opportunities. We will prove that Isabella Rossi systematically isolated Richard Sterling from his wife and business partner, that she fed his insecurities, and that she poisoned his mind until he signed a document that betrayed the single most important legacy any man can leave his own child. This was not an act of love. It was the final move in a long and calculated con. The first few days of the trial were a brutal parade of witnesses. David Chen was called to the stand. Thorne's cross-examination was merciless. He forced David to admit that Richard had complained about his marriage, that he had felt pressured by the impending fatherhood, and that he had described his time with Isabella as the only time he felt truly alive. Each admission felt like a fresh betrayal to Amelia. When Eleanor questioned David, she focused on Richard's behavior in his final months. Mr. Chen, did you notice a change in Richard's business practices after Ms. Rossi became a more permanent fixture in his life? Yes, David admitted reluctantly. He became more impulsive. He made a couple of risky acquisitions against the board's advice. He seemed distracted, paranoid. He installed security software on all our systems because he was convinced a competitor was trying to steal his ideas. And who recommended that software? Eleanor asked. Isabella, David said, his voice barely a whisper. She introduced him to the company. Next came Richard's executive assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah. She testified that in the last year Ms. Rossi had become the gatekeeper to Richard. Calls were routed through her and meetings were scheduled or canceled based on her approval. He called her his strategic advisor, Sarah said, but it felt more like she was his handler. The turning point came when Eleanor called Clara, the former gallery curator, to the stand. Thorne immediately objected, arguing her testimony about Julian Croft was irrelevant and prejudicial. After a heated bench conference, the judge allowed it, but with a strict warning to the jury to consider it only as potential evidence of a pattern, not as proof of wrongdoing in this specific case. Clara recounted the story of Julian Croft, his sudden death in the will. Then Eleanor played the voicemail. Isabella's voice, younger but unmistakably hers, filled the courtroom, dripping with venom. I won't make that mistake again. Next time I'll make sure it's all locked down before the idiot even gets a cold. A shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. Isabella's composure finally broke. Her face went white with fury, and she shot a venomous glare at the witness stand. For the first time, the jury saw the predator beneath the poise. But the final and most feared part of the trial was Amelia's own testimony. Marcus Thorne would get to cross-examine her, and she knew he would try to rip her life apart. On the stand, under Eleanor's gentle questioning, Amelia recounted her life with Richard. The good times, the love, his excitement about their son. She did not cry. She spoke with a quiet, powerful dignity. Then Thorne approached, circling her like a shark. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that you and your husband argued frequently in the last year?" "We had disagreements like any married couple. Disagreements about his work hours, about his friends. Isn't it true you told him he was becoming a self-obsessed caricature of himself during a fight just 2 months before he died?" Amelia paled. It was true. A private, painful moment was now a weapon against her. "I was upset. We were both under a lot of stress." "Stress? Or was the fairy tale ending?" Thorne pressed. "Isn't it true you were primarily concerned with the lifestyle he provided, the house, the cars, the status?" "No," Amelia said, her voice firm. "I was an architect with my own career when I met him. I loved my husband." "You loved him so much that when he died, your first act wasn't just to grieve, but to hire one of the most expensive lawyers in the state to sue for his money. Money he explicitly, in a legal document, left to another woman." "My first act," Amelia said, her voice rising with emotion as she looked directly at the jury, her hand on her belly, "was to survive. And when I found out that the man I loved had been convinced to sign away our child's future, my next act was to fight for my son. This isn't about greed. It's about a mother protecting her baby from being erased by the woman who destroyed our family." Her words hung in the silent courtroom. For the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt on the faces in the jury box. She had survived the attack. She had told her truth. Now all she could do was wait and pray that it was enough. The trial was drawing to a close. Both sides had presented their cases, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The prevailing wisdom among the legal pundits covering the case was that it was too close to call. Thorne had successfully planted seeds of doubt about Amelia's motives, while Eleanor had exposed the predatory side of Isabella. It all came down to which narrative the jury found more believable. Amelia felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for a verdict that would define the rest of her life. On the night before closing arguments, a frantic call came from Frank Miller, the private investigator. "I think I've got something big," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "It's a long shot, but you need to hear this. Remember the security software Isabella had Richard install at Nexus Dynamics, the one she recommended?" "Yes," Eleanor said, putting the call on speaker so Amelia could hear. "I've been digging into the company that makes it, a firm called Viridian Shield. It's a boutique cybersecurity outfit based in Delaware. I ran a deep corporate records search. Guess who is the primary silent investor behind the shell corporation that owns Viridian Shield?" There was a pause. "Don't tell me," Eleanor breathed. "Isabella Rossi," Frank confirmed. "She funded its creation 3 years ago with the first big payout she got from Richard's investments. The software wasn't to protect him from competitors. It was to spy on him. It would have given her remote backdoor access to everything. His emails, his financial transactions, his calendar. Everything." Amelia felt a wave of nausea. The paranoia Richard had exhibited wasn't just in his head. It had been actively manufactured by the very person he trusted most. "Can you prove it?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with urgency. "I have the incorporation documents. But proving she used it to spy is harder. The software's logs would be on Nexus Dynamics' main server. We'd need a court order to access it, and the trial is ending tomorrow." "We don't have time for an order," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "But we don't need the logs. We just need the truth." The next morning, as Isabella Rossi took the stand for a final rebuttal testimony, looking poised and confident, Eleanor approached the lectern for her cross-examination. "Ms. Rossi," Eleanor began calmly, "you've testified that your relationship with Mr. Sterling was based on mutual trust and understanding, correct?" "That's right," Isabella said, smiling serenely. "We had no secrets." "No secrets. So you would have told him, of course, that you were the secret owner of Viridian Shield, the cybersecurity company whose software you insisted he install across his entire company." The question hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Marcus Thorne shot to his feet, shouting, "Objection, Relevance Foundation!" But it was too late. The damage was done. Isabella's serene mask dissolved into a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Her eyes darted toward Thorne, a silent plea for help. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice losing its carefully modulated calm. Eleanor walked towards the witness box, holding up a document. "This is the incorporation filing for the shell company that owns Viridian Shield Mizrazi. The primary investor is listed under a trust that my investigator has traced directly back to a bank account in the Cayman Islands, an account that you opened 3 years ago. Would you like me to continue?" Thorne was frantically whispering to Isabella, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at Eleanor, her face a mixture of hatred and fear. The judge, intrigued, overruled Thorne's objection. "The witness will answer the question. Mr. Sterling's paranoia about corporate espionage, that wasn't real, was it, Mizrazi?" Eleanor pressed on, her voice like ice. "You stoked those fears. You created the problem so you could sell him your solution. A solution that gave you a backdoor into every aspect of his life. You didn't just influence him with words. You monitored his every move. You read his emails to his wife. You saw his business plans. You knew exactly which levers to pull. Isn't that right?" "No, that's a lie!" Isabella shrieked, her composure utterly shattered. "He wanted my help. He was losing his edge. He needed me." "He needed you, or you needed his password," Eleanor shot back. "The will Mizrazi, was that his idea? Or did you just happen to see the draft of his old will on his computer and decide to help him revise it?" It was the final devastating blow. By revealing the spying, Eleanor hadn't just proven undue influence. She had exposed a level of cold, calculated manipulation that bordered on criminal. Isabella's credibility, so carefully constructed over weeks of testimony, had been annihilated in under 5 minutes. She was no longer the tragic soulmate. She was a spy who had bugged the man she claimed to love. Marcus Thorne knew the case was lost. His request for a redirect was limp, and Isabella's denials were hysterical and unconvincing. In her closing argument, Eleanor didn't need theatrics. She simply laid out the facts. "This was never a love affair," she told the jury. "It was a corporate takeover of a human being. And like any hostile takeover, the goal was a total acquisition of assets. Richard Sterling was not a lover to Isabella Rossi. He was her target. And his son, his unborn child, was just collateral damage in her ruthless pursuit of his fortune." As the jury filed out to deliberate, Amelia looked across the courtroom at Isabella. The beautiful, confident woman was gone. In her place was a pale, trembling figure, exposed and defeated. Amelia felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness for the man who had been so blind and for the life he had so carelessly thrown away. The battle was over. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. It was a lifetime. Amelia sat with Chloe and Eleanor in the sterile courthouse waiting room, unable to speak. Every possible outcome warred in her mind. What if they lost? What would she do? Where would she go? The life of her child hung in the balance, a thought so terrifying she had to physically push it away. When the bailiff called them back into the courtroom, the silence was absolute. Amelia's hand flew to her stomach, a protective shield. Isabella Rossi and Marcus Thorne were already at their table, Isabella looking ashen. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, stood and handed the verdict to the clerk. She refused to look at the defendant's table, a detail Eleanor noted with a tiny reassuring squeeze of Amelia's arm. The clerk cleared his throat and read from the paper. In the matter of the estate of Richard Sterling, on the challenge of the will dated February 12th, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Amelia Hayes. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The clerk continued, "We find that the will is invalid due to proven undue influence exerted by the defendant, Ms. Isabella Rossi." Amelia broke. The dam of composure she had maintained for months burst, and silent, hot tears streamed down her face. Chloe wrapped her arms around her, sobbing with relief. It was over. They had won. The court invalidated the new will, meaning the estate would revert to Richard's previous will, the one written after their wedding which named Amelia as the sole beneficiary. Isabella Rossi simply stared into the middle distance, her expression blank as if she couldn't process the words. Her empire built on secrets and seduction had crumbled to dust. The legal battle had not only cost her the sterling fortune, but had exposed her past dealings, and the district attorney's office was already opening a fraud investigation against her and her company, Viridian Shield. 6 weeks later, Amelia gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She did not name him Richard. She named him Christopher after her own father, a man of quiet integrity. It was a conscious decision to give her son a new legacy, one untainted by the scandal and secrets of his father. Life slowly found a new rhythm. The silence in the Beverly Hills mansion was no longer haunting. It was filled with the gurgles and cries of a newborn. Amelia, with the help of a reconstituted board of directors, led by a deeply remorseful David Chen, took control of Nexus Dynamics. She proved to be a natural leader, her architect's mind for structure and detail translating surprisingly well to the corporate world. She was not her husband. She was more cautious, more collaborative, and more ethical, and under her guidance the company stabilized and thrived. She never became the society queen Margaret Sterling had once hoped for. Instead, she became something far more formidable, a respected businesswoman and a devoted single mother. She sold the sprawling mansion, finding it too full of ghosts, and moved into a more modest but beautiful home in a quieter neighborhood. One of her first major acts as head of the estate was to establish the Sterling Foundation, but she changed its mission. Instead of funding the flashy art projects Richard had favored, she dedicated it to supporting single mothers and providing legal aid to women fighting unjust wills and predatory relationships. She took the ugliest chapter of her life and used its power to ensure other women would not have to fight the same battles alone. Years later, a journalist asked her if she ever forgave Richard. She paused, looking out the window of her office, a picture of a smiling, gap-toothed Christopher on her desk. "I have forgiven him for his weakness," she said finally. "I have forgiven him for being manipulated. But I don't think I'll ever forgive him for the choice he made for underestimating my strength and for almost making our son pay the price. He left his fortune to the wrong woman. I'm just the one who had to prove it. She had inherited more than Richard's money. She had inherited his power, and she was determined to wield it with the wisdom and compassion he had so tragically lacked. Her fight was over, but her true legacy and Christopher's was just beginning." Amelia Hayes's story is a harrowing yet ultimately inspiring testament to a mother's resilience. It's a reminder that a person's true character isn't revealed when life is easy, but when they are stripped of everything and forced to fight for what matters most. She faced down grief, betrayal, and a hostile legal system, not for money, but for her child's right to exist. Her victory wasn't just in a courtroom. It was in rewriting her own future and turning her pain into a shield for others. What do you think was Amelia's fight about justice or revenge? What would you have done in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of strength and survival moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a story of triumph over adversity. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that need to be told. Thank you for watching. The first thing she felt wasn't the pain from the surgery, but a profound, chilling silence. Isabella Rossi lay in a private suite at Cedars-Sinai, the kind of room that costs more per night than most people make in a month. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and expensive lilies, should have been filled with the comforting murmur of her husband's voice. But Damien wasn't there. The chair beside her bed was empty. Her hand, which had reached for his, found only cold, starched sheets. He had promised he'd be there when she woke up. And in that hollow silence, a terrifying thought began to bloom. What if the promise, like the man who made it, was a lie? Life with Damien Blackwood was a meticulously curated masterpiece, and Isabella Rossi was his most prized acquisition. Their Bel Air mansion was a symphony of glass and white marble with infinity pools that bled into the Los Angeles skyline and a garage that housed a fleet of silent, powerful cars. Damien, a titan of tech private equity, had built his empire from nothing, and he managed his life with the same ruthless precision he applied to his hostile takeovers. Every party was a calculated networking event, every vacation a photo opportunity for Forbes, and every moment of their marriage a testament to his success. Isabella had once been an art historian with a burgeoning career, her passion lying in the quiet dust of forgotten Renaissance studios. But Damien had found that quaint. "You won't need to work, my love," he'd whispered to her on their honeymoon in Santorini, his hand possessively on her back. "Your job is to be my beautiful wife, to be the grace in this world of brutes." And she, blinded by his charm and the sheer gravitational pull of his ambition, had believed him. She'd traded her dusty archives for walk-in closets the size of her old apartment, her academic pursuits for the art of hosting flawless dinner parties for Silicon Valley billionaires and Hollywood producers. Yet the gilded cage, for all its shimmering beauty, was still a cage. The staff reported to Damien. The credit cards sent alerts to his phone. Her friends were gradually replaced by a circle of women who were wives of Damien's associates, their conversations as glossy and superficial as the magazines they graced. He didn't yell or raise his voice. His control was far more insidious. It was in the subtle critique of her dress choice, the casual dismissal of an opinion she offered, the way he'd steer her away from an old friend at a gala with a grip on her elbow that was just a little too tight. "Isabella, darling, that dress is lovely, but the blue in the Armani brings out your eyes so much more, don't you think?" he'd say, and the dress would be changed. "That's an interesting thought, sweetheart, but let's leave the financial talk to the experts," he'd chuckle, and she'd fall silent. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of his approval. The loneliness was a quiet ache, a constant companion in the echoing marble halls of their home. Her only true solace was in the small hidden studio she'd set up in a forgotten corner of the estate, where she would lose herself for hours in her own paintings, vibrant, emotional canvases that were the very antithesis of her sterile life. She never showed them to Damien. They were the only part of her that was still truly hers. The pain started as a dull throb in her side, a nuisance she ignored for weeks, attributing it to stress. But it sharpened into a blade, relentless and unforgiving. A series of discreet visits to the best doctors in Beverly Hills confirmed their fears, a large complex ovarian cyst that required immediate surgical removal. It was benign, they assured her, but the procedure was major. Damien, to his credit, was the picture of a concerned husband. He cleared his schedule, a feat Isabella knew was akin to parting the Red Sea. He personally consulted with Dr. Evans, the top surgeon in the state. He booked the most exclusive private suite at Cedars-Sinai, ensuring a level of privacy and luxury befitting the Blackwood name. "Nothing is too good for you, my darling," he'd said, stroking her hair as she lay pale and nervous in their king-sized bed the night before the surgery. "I'll be right there in the waiting room. I'll pace the floors. I'll bribe every nurse for updates. And the very second you open your eyes, I'll be the first thing you see. I promise." He held her, his embrace firm, protective. For a fleeting moment, the cracks in their facade seemed to seal over. She felt a surge of the love she'd first felt for this powerful, dynamic man. He was her husband, her protector. He would be there, he promised. The morning of the surgery was a blur of sterile efficiency. Nurses with kind, professional smiles prepped her. Damien stood by her gurney, dressed in an impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit, his hand holding hers. His phone buzzed incessantly, but he ignored it, his focus seemingly entirely on her. "Don't you worry about a thing," he whispered, kissing her forehead, just before they wheeled her away towards the operating theater. "I've handled everything. Just get some rest. I'll be here when you wake up." Those were the last words she heard from him. As the anesthetic began to snake its way through her veins, pulling her down into a dreamless dark, her last conscious thought was of his face, his promise echoing in the fading light. He would be there. Everything would be fine. The man who controlled every aspect of her life would surely not falter in this. The man she loved, or at least the man she had convinced herself she loved, would be waiting. The first sensation was a dull, throbbing ache that radiated from her abdomen. The second was the scratch of high thread count sheets against her skin. Isabella's eyelids fluttered open, heavy as lead shutters. The world swam into a blurry mosaic of muted beige and soft indirect lighting. She was in the recovery suite, the one Damien had insisted upon. A vase of white lilies, ostentatiously large, sat on a table in the corner, their cloying scent mingling with the clinical smell of the hospital. She turned her head, a slow, painful movement. "Damien!" She rasped, her throat raw from the intubation tube. The room was silent. The plush visitor's chair beside her bed, upholstered in a soft gray velvet, was empty. A flicker of confusion, not yet alarm, went through her. Maybe he'd stepped out to take a call. His work was relentless, she knew that. Or perhaps he was with Dr. Evans getting the post-op report. Yes, that must be it. He was a man of action, of details. He'd want to know everything before he saw her. She relaxed slightly, sinking back into the pillows and closing her eyes, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a lulling counterpoint to her pain. An hour passed. A nurse with a warm smile and a name tag that read Jessica came in to check her vitals. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Blackwood?" Jessica asked, her voice gentle as she adjusted the IV drip. "A bit sore," Isabella murmured. "Is my husband? Is he with the doctor?" Jessica's smile tightened for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of discomfort that Isabella in her drowsy state almost missed. "Dr. Evans will be by shortly to see you. Just try to rest for now." The answer was evasive, a smooth redirection. Another hour bled into the next. The anesthetic fog began to clear, replaced by a growing unease that was sharper than her surgical pain. Damien was never late. Punctuality was a religion to him. For him to not be here, for him to not have stormed this room the moment she was out of surgery, was not just unusual. It was unthinkable. She fumbled for the call button, her fingers weak. When Jessica returned, Isabella's voice was stronger, edged with anxiety. "Where is my husband? Has anyone heard from him? Please, I need to speak to him. Let me just check at the nurse's station for you, Mrs. Blackwood." Jessica said, her professional calm beginning to feel like a carefully constructed wall. She was gone for a long time, too long. Isabella's heart started to pound against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that made the monitor beep faster. She tried to sit up, but a searing pain shot through her abdomen and she fell back with a gasp, tears of frustration and pain welling in her eyes. She was trapped, powerless in this silent, luxurious room. Finally, Jessica returned, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She was accompanied by a stern-looking hospital administrator in a charcoal suit. The administrator, a woman named Ms. Albright, was holding a tablet. "Mrs. Blackwood." Ms. Albright began, her tone devoid of warmth. "My name is Patricia Albright. I'm the head of patient services." "Where is Damien?" Isabella demanded, cutting through the formalities. "Did something happen? Was there an accident?" Panic was a cold serpent coiling in her gut. That was the only explanation. He had to have been in an accident. Ms. Albright exchanged a look with Jessica. "Mr. Blackwood is not on the premises, Mrs. Blackwood. He settled the entirety of your hospital bill, a very generous prepayment, I might add, about an hour after your surgery began. And then he left." The words didn't compute. Left. Settled the bill. It was like trying to solve an equation where all the numbers were wrong. Left. Left to go. Where? Did he leave a message? A note. Ms. Albright cleared her throat, a dry rustling sound. "He left a message with his assistant, who then relayed it to us. The message was that he had urgent business to attend to and that you were in the hospital's capable hands." She paused, tapping her tablet. "He also signed your discharge papers in advance. Once Dr. Evans clears you, which should be in a day or two, you'll be free to go." Free to go. The phrase hung in the air, clinical and cruel. Isabella stared at the administrator, then at the nurse, searching their faces for some sign that this was a monstrous mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. She saw only pity in Jessica's eyes and a cool, bureaucratic detachment in Ms. Albright's. His assistant, Isabella's voice was a whisper. He didn't even call himself. That is the information we were given. Ms. Albright stated her patience, clearly wearing thin. Now, if you'll excuse me, nurse, please let me know if Mrs. Blackwood needs anything else. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, leaving a wake of devastating silence. Isabella turned to Jessica, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. He promised, she breathed, the words catching in her throat. He promised he would be here when I woke up. Jessica's professional facade finally crumbled. She reached out and placed a comforting hand on Isabella's arm. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. But the apology was just noise. Isabella's world had tilted on its axis. He had paid the bill. He had signed her discharge papers. He had left a message with an assistant. These weren't the actions of a concerned husband rushing off to an emergency. These were the calculated, sterile actions of a man closing a transaction. She was a line item on a balance sheet, a liability that had been dealt with and dismissed. She lay there, the physical pain in her body completely overshadowed by a tidal wave of emotional agony. He had left her. He had abandoned her in a hospital bed hours after major surgery, when she was at her most vulnerable. The promise whispered against her forehead in the soft light of their bedroom had been nothing but a puff of empty air. The man who had vowed to protect her had just delivered the most brutal wound of all, and he'd done it without leaving a single scar a surgeon could fix. The next 24 hours were a waking nightmare. Isabella drifted in and out of a fitful, painkiller-induced sleep, and each time she woke, the cold reality of her situation slammed into her with renewed force. The empty chair beside her bed became a monument to Damien's absence. She stared at it until her eyes burned, half expecting him to materialize with a charming smile and a plausible explanation that would make all of this a bad dream. But he never came. Her phone, which a nurse had retrieved from her personal belongings, was a dead brick on the bedside table. She'd tried calling Damien a dozen times. Each call went straight to voicemail, his smooth, recorded voice a mocking echo of the man she thought she knew. You've reached Damien Blackwood. I'm unavailable. Leave a message. She didn't. What could she possibly say? She tried his personal assistant, a perpetually flustered young man named Jeffrey. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice strained. Mrs. Blackwood, I hope the surgery went well. Jeffrey, where is he? Isabella's voice was thin but urgent. The hospital said he left. There has to be a reason. Is it a family emergency? A crisis at the company? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the static of Jeffrey's discomfort. Mr. Blackwood left very specific instructions. Mrs. Blackwood, I am not to disclose his location. He said you would understand. Understand? Understand? What, she cried, her voice cracking. Jeffrey, I just had surgery. I'm alone. I don't understand anything, he said. He said to tell you the arrangements have been made and that the house staff are at your disposal upon your discharge. Jeffrey stammered, clearly reading from a script. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. I have a call coming in. I have to go. He hung up before she could say another word. Arrangements have been made. The house staff are at your disposal. It was the language one used to manage property, not to speak to one's wife. The coldness of it was breathtaking. Desperate, she called the one person she thought was a genuine friend in her curated social circle, a woman named Portia Van Doren. Portia was the wife of one of Damien's business partners, a woman whose life was a whirlwind of charity luncheons and couture fittings. Isabella, darling. Portia's voice was like tinkling champagne glasses. I heard about your surgery. How dreadful. Are you recovering well? You must be. Cedars has the best recovery suites. Did you get the one with the view of the Hollywood sign, Portia? I need your help, Isabella said, her throat tight. I can't find Damien. He left the hospital yesterday and I haven't heard from him since. Do you know where he is? A beat of silence. When Portia spoke again, her voice had lost its effervescence, replaced by a cautious, pitying tone. "Oh, darling, you mean you haven't seen what it's all over page 6 online? And that dreadful gossip blog, the LA Ledger? I thought, well, I assumed you knew." Isabella's blood ran cold. With trembling fingers, she ended the call with Portia and opened her phone's web browser. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. She found the LA Ledger's website. The headline, plastered next to a grainy but unmistakable paparazzi photo, felt like a physical blow. Damian Blackwood's new asset tech mogul dines at Spago with model Serafina Jade while wife is under the knife. The photo showed Damian at a candlelit table, leaning in close to a stunningly beautiful young woman with fiery red hair. He was smiling a genuine, unguarded smile Isabella hadn't seen directed at her in years. He was holding the woman's hand. The timestamp on the article was from the previous evening. While Isabella had been lying in a post-operative haze, terrified and alone, her husband had been on a date. The article was brutal, filled with salacious details from an inside source. It spoke of a month-long affair, of Damian's plans to rebrand his personal life, of Serafina being a more suitable partner for a man of his global stature. It even mentioned her surgery, callously framing it as the opportune moment for Damian to make his move. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. A wave of nausea more intense than any post-surgical discomfort washed over her. It wasn't just that he'd left her. He had orchestrated it. Her surgery, her most vulnerable moment, had been his exit strategy. She was a loose end he was tidying up before launching his new life. The final devastating blow came the next morning. Dr. Evans, a kind man with weary eyes, came to sign her official discharge. "You're recovering well, Isabella," he said gently. "Physically, at least. You're cleared to go home." Home. The word was a mockery. A few minutes later, Ms. Albright, the administrator, returned. "Mrs. Blackwood, as you are now discharged, we do need you to vacate the suite within the next 2 hours to prepare it for the next patient," she said, her tone brisk. "Your husband's assistant arranged for a car service. It's waiting for you downstairs." Isabella felt a surge of defiance. "I'm not ready to leave." Ms. Albright's expression hardened. "I'm afraid it's not a request. The room is booked." She then delivered the coup de grace. "Also, there was a small matter with your personal credit card on file for incidentals. It was declined. As Mr. Blackwood only covered the procedural costs, we'll need you to settle the outstanding balance for—" She consulted her tablet. "Mini-bar charges and premium channel access before you leave. It's a minor sum. $378.50. Declined." Her card had never been declined in her life. She tried to log into her banking app. Access denied. She tried the joint account she shared with Damian. Access denied. He hadn't just left her. He had cut her off. Completely. He had left her stranded post-surgery in a hospital that was now kicking her out with no access to money. The full, terrifying scope of his cruelty was laid bare. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had meticulously planned her destruction. He had left her with nothing but a waiting car to take her back to a house that no longer felt like a home, but the scene of a crime. She was a prisoner being released into a larger, more terrifying prison, a life where she had absolutely nothing. Isabella sat on the edge of the hospital bed, the crisp discharge papers feeling like a death sentence in her lap. The designer clothes a nurse had retrieved for her, a silk blouse and cashmere trousers chosen by Damian's stylist, felt like a costume for a role she no longer played. She was a millionaire's wife with less than $40 in her purse and a credit card that was now a useless piece of plastic. The car service Damian had so thoughtfully arranged was waiting downstairs, ready to transport her back to the marble mausoleum where she was supposed to quietly fade away. She was trapped, and the walls of the luxurious suite felt like they were closing in. It was in this moment of absolute despair that a soft knock echoed on her door. "Yes," she called out, her voice hoarse, expecting a nurse with a wheelchair. The door opened, but it wasn't a nurse. It was a man. He was tall and elegantly dressed in a charcoal gray suit that was tailored to perfection, but worn with a casual grace that Damien's rigid formality always lacked. He had kind, intelligent eyes, a strong jawline, and dark hair with the faintest touch of silver at the temples. He looked familiar, but in a distant, dreamlike way. "Isabella Rossi," he asked, his voice, a calm, deep baritone that was instantly soothing. She flinched at the use of her maiden name. No one had called her that in a decade. "It's Blackwood now," she corrected him out of habit, then immediately regretted it. "Yes, I'm Isabella. My name is Nathaniel Sterling," he said, stepping fully into the room. He moved with a quiet confidence, an aura of power that was different from Damien's. Damien's power was a sledgehammer, loud and demanding attention. This man's was like a deep river, silent but immensely strong. "I know this is unexpected. We met once, a very long time ago, at a fundraiser for the university arts program. You were giving a speech on pre-Renaissance fresco techniques." The memory surfaced hazy and distant. It was over 10 years ago, before Damien, when she was still a passionate post-grad student with fire in her eyes. She remembered a handsome young man in the audience who had asked an incredibly insightful question afterward. They had spoken for almost an hour, a conversation that had felt electric. Nathaniel Sterling. He had been a young tech investor then, just starting his own firm. "I remember," she said, stunned. "You founded Sterling Innovations." "I did," he confirmed with a small smile. "And I remember you being the most brilliant and passionate person in the room. I was disappointed when I heard you'd given it all up." His words, a simple acknowledgement of the person she used to be, were like a balm on a raw wound. Tears pricked her eyes. "What are you doing here, Mr. Sterling? Please call me Nathaniel. And I'm here because I make it my business to know what my chief competitor is doing," he said, his expression turning serious. "And my chief competitor is Damien Blackwood." Isabella stared at him, confused. Damien had never mentioned Nathaniel Sterling as a competitor. He'd always dismissed Sterling Innovations as a minor player. "I read the gossip rags." Isabella. Nathaniel continued, his gaze direct and filled with an empathy she hadn't seen in years. "And I know Damien. I know how he operates. He doesn't just end things, he annihilates them. He liquidates assets, freezes accounts, and controls the narrative. I had a feeling you might be in a difficult position." It was an understatement of epic proportions. "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it," she whispered, a dry, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "I know." He gestured to the chair Damien should have been sitting in. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat down, leaning forward with an air of quiet intensity. "Isabella, what I'm about to tell you will be hard to hear, but you need to know the truth. Your marriage wasn't just a relationship to Damien, it was a strategic merger." "What are you talking about?" your father, Nathaniel, said gently. "Professor Alistair Rossi. Before he passed away, he was a brilliant software engineer, not just an art history enthusiast. In his spare time, he was developing a revolutionary data compression algorithm. He was years ahead of his time. He never patented it properly. He was an academic, not a businessman. He kept all his research in personal journals." Isabella's mind reeled. She knew her father had dabbled in programming, but she had no idea it was anything serious. He had died suddenly of a heart attack when she was in college, leaving her heartbroken. "After he died," Nathaniel continued, his voice low, "those journals went to you, his next of kin. A year later, you met Damien Blackwood at a charity event your father used to support. Do you think that was a coincidence? Damien knew about your father's work. He knew the potential of that algorithm. He didn't just marry you, Isabella. He acquired you. He acquired you to get his hands on your father's intellectual property." The room began to spin. Isabella thought back to their early courtship. Damien had been so interested in her father asking questions about his life, his hobbies, his old office. He'd helped her sort through her father's things, boxing them up for storage. He'd been so helpful, so supportive. Now she saw it for what it was, a meticulously planned heist. The core technology that Blackwood Global was built on, Nathaniel stated, his words hitting her like stones, the very foundation of his $10 billion empire, was stolen from your father. The air left her lungs. Her entire marriage, the past decade of her life, was a lie. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a long, calculated con. She wasn't a wife. She was the key to a vault, and now that he had emptied it, he was discarding her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I respected your father. We corresponded a few times before he died. He was a genius. And because I despise what Damien Blackwood stands for. He builds his empire on the ruins of other people's lives. He did it to my company 5 years ago with a hostile takeover attempt, and he did it to you in the most personal way imaginable." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling city. "Damien has left you here stranded and penniless because he believes you are powerless. He assumes you'll go quietly. He's arranged a car to take you back to a house where you'll be a well-cared-for prisoner until the divorce settlement, where he'll bully you into signing an ironclad NDA. He thinks he has won." Nathaniel turned back to face her, his eyes blazing with a fierce light. "But he's made one mistake. He underestimated you, and he didn't account for me." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim, elegant envelope. "Your father's original algorithm is obsolete now, but the principles behind it are not. What Damien doesn't know is that your father was working on a second-generation version, something even more powerful. I believe the key to it is still in his research that Damien probably overlooked. If we can find it, we can not only build something new, but we can also prove he stole the original concept." He placed the envelope on the bedside table. "This contains a passport in your name, your real name, and a plane ticket. My jet is waiting at the Santa Monica airport. It can take you far away from here, somewhere you can heal and decide what you want to do next. The car Damien sent is downstairs, but my car is also waiting at the service exit." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of compassion and challenge. "You have a choice, Isabella. You can get in his car and go back to the gilded cage, or you can get in mine and start fighting back." The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was a lifeline. For 10 years, Isabella had floated in the gilded, stagnant waters of Damien's world. Now she was drowning, and Nathaniel Sterling had just thrown her a life raft. To get in Damien's car was to accept her fate as a discarded object. To get in Nathaniel's was to reclaim the ghost of the woman she used to be. The service exit, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. A spark of the old fire, the fire Damien had so carefully extinguished, flickered back to life. A genuine smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "Good. We don't have much time. Damien's security will be monitoring the main entrance. They'll report back the second his car leaves." He looked at her hospital gown. "We need to get you dressed." The simple act of changing clothes became an act of rebellion. She peeled off the sterile hospital gown, a symbol of her vulnerability, and slowly, carefully pulled on the silk blouse and cashmere trousers. They were Damien's choices, but she would wear them as armor for her escape. Every movement sent a twinge of pain through her incision, but it was a good pain. It was a reminder that she had survived. While she dressed, Nathaniel was a model of quiet efficiency. He spoke softly into his phone, giving a series of coded instructions. "The package is mobile. Egress point B. 5 minutes." He packed her few belongings, her phone, her wallet with its useless cards, a paperback novel into her designer handbag. "My father's research," Isabella said, suddenly her mind racing. "It's in a storage unit in Pasadena. Damien put it all there years ago. He said it was to declutter the house. Of course, he'd hidden the evidence in plain sight." "Don't worry about that," Nathaniel said, his focus absolute. "I'll have a team retrieve it before he even realizes you're gone. The unit is in your maiden name, isn't it?" "Yes." She breathed, amazed at his foresight. I thought so. He'd want to keep it at arm's length legally. He glanced at the door. It's time. Nurse Jessica appeared at that moment, a wheelchair in tow. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Nathaniel, but a look of understanding and perhaps quiet approval dawned on her face. She had seen too many stories like Isabella's play out in these sterile rooms. Dr. Evans said you might need some help getting downstairs. Mrs. Blackwood, Jessica said, her tone professional, but her eyes conveying a different message. Thank you, Jessica, Isabella said, giving the nurse a grateful look. Nathaniel placed a steadying hand on her arm as she eased herself into the wheelchair. We're ready. Jessica pushed the wheelchair into the hallway. Instead of turning left toward the main public elevators, she turned right toward a stark metal door marked Staff Only. She swiped a keycard and the door clicked open, revealing a drab concrete service corridor. The service elevator is at the end of the hall. It goes directly down to the loading bay, Jessica whispered. Good luck. She squeezed Isabella's shoulder and then, with a final nod, turned and disappeared back into the main corridor. The journey down in the rattling freight elevator was tense. The air was cold and smelled of disinfectant. Isabella's heart hammered in her chest. This was real. She was escaping. For the first time in a decade, she was making a decision for herself, a terrifying, exhilarating leap into the unknown. The elevator doors opened onto a cavernous, dimly lit loading bay. A sleek black Audi A8, its engine humming silently, was parked near the exit ramp, indistinguishable from the other executive cars, yet positioned for a swift departure. The driver, a large man with a calm demeanor, got out and opened the back door as they approached. Nathaniel helped her from the wheelchair into the plush leather seat of the car. The motion sent a sharp pain through her side, and she winced, catching her breath. Easy, he said, his voice a low murmur as he slid in beside her. You're safe now. The driver closed the door and the opulent interior of the car enveloped them, shutting out the grim reality of the loading dock. The car pulled away smoothly, ascending the ramp and merging into the bright Los Angeles sunlight. Isabella risked a glance back at the imposing glass facade of Cedars-Sinai. She had entered it as Mrs. Damian Blackwood, a prized possession. She was leaving as Isabella Rossi, a fugitive. They drove in silence for a few moments, navigating the city's traffic with practiced ease. Isabella's phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out. The screen read, Damian Blackwood. Her breath hitched. He was calling. After 2 days of silence, he was calling. Don't answer it, Nathaniel said, his eyes on the phone. Let it go to voicemail. He's probably just been alerted that his car service left the hospital. Without you in it, he's checking in, expecting to hear your confused, compliant voice. She watched the screen, her thumb hovering over the decline button. It felt like the most important decision of her life. Answering meant being pulled back into his orbit, his web of lies and control. Ignoring it was a declaration of war. She let the call ring out, the vibration of the phone against her palm, a final desperate plea from a life she was leaving behind. A moment later, a notification popped up, a new voicemail. He's starting his damage control, Nathaniel surmised. First he'll try to sound concerned. Then when he can't reach you, he'll get angry. And then he'll get dangerous. The drive to the Santa Monica airport was a blur of palm trees and sun-drenched boulevards. The world outside the tinted windows seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding within. They bypassed the main terminal, driving through a private security gate that opened onto the tarmac itself. And there it was, a Gulfstream G650, sleek and white with a single discreet silver S on its tail. The jet's stairs were down waiting. As the Audi came to a stop at the foot of the stairs, Isabella felt a wave of dizziness. It was all happening so fast. The surgery, the abandonment, the shocking revelations. And now this. We're almost there, Nathaniel said, his hand briefly touching hers, a gesture of reassurance. As they stepped out of the car, the roar of another jet taking off nearby filled the air. A flight attendant in a chic, dark uniform greeted them at the top of the stairs with a warm smile. The interior of the jet was a study in understated luxury cream leather seats, polished dark wood, and soft ambient lighting. Isabella sank into one of the plush seats, the supple leather sighing around her. Through the oval window she watched the ground crew scurry below. A few minutes later the cabin door was sealed. The engine spooled up with a deep hum, and the plane began to taxi onto the runway. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Damien. "Isabella, where are you? My driver said you weren't there. This isn't funny. Call me immediately." The tone was already shifting from feigned concern to irritation. She looked at the message, then at Nathaniel, who was watching her with a calm, steady gaze. Without a word, she held down the power button on her phone. The screen went black. She had severed the last link. The jet accelerated down the runway, a powerful, unstoppable force. As it lifted into the sky, banking gracefully over the Pacific Ocean, Isabella watched the sprawling cityscape of Los Angeles shrink below her until it was nothing more than a glittering, hazy memory. She was flying away from her gilded cage, away from the man who had tried to break her. She didn't know where she was going, not really, or what the future held. All she knew was that she was free. And for the first time in 10 years, she could finally breathe. Their destination was Lake Como, Italy. Nathaniel's private villa, Villa Serafina, a name that was a cruel cosmic irony Isabella chose to ignore, was a secluded paradise carved into the cliffs overlooking the water. It was a place of old stone, cascading bougainvillea, and a profound, healing quiet. The transition from the cold, sterile environment of the hospital to this haven of warmth and beauty was jarring, but in the best possible way. The first week was a blur of sleep-gentle walks through the terraced gardens and simple, delicious meals prepared by Nathaniel's discreet staff. He gave her space, never pressing, never crowding. He had set her up in a suite of rooms with a private balcony that offered a breathtaking view of the lake and the mist-shrouded Alps beyond. He provided her with clothes, simple, elegant pieces of linen and cashmere, and a secure laptop and phone. He was a perfect host, a considerate guardian, but there was a professional distance he maintained, and she was grateful for it. She needed to heal, not just physically from the surgery, but emotionally from the deep septic wound of Damien's betrayal. Her body mended faster than her spirit. The sharp pain of her incision faded to a dull ache, but the ache in her soul was constant. She would wake up from nightmares, her heart pounding, the image of Damien's smiling face in the paparazzi photo burned into her mind. During the day, she would find herself staring out at the tranquil lake, replaying a decade of her life, searching for the red flags she had so willingly ignored. The manipulation had been so subtle, so masterful, that she felt like a fool for never having seen it. Nathaniel's team, as promised, had secured the contents of her father's storage unit. Crates of journals, notebooks, and old floppy disks arrived at the villa. One rainy afternoon, Isabella found the courage to open the first box. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air, a scent from her childhood. She ran her fingers over her father's familiar spidery handwriting, and for the first time since her ordeal began, she cried. She cried for the father she missed, for the brilliant mind that had been plundered, and for the naive young woman who had unwittingly handed over her legacy to a monster. Those journals became her salvation. She spent her days poring over them, rediscovering the man she had lost. Amidst his notes on art and history, she found the complex equations and flowcharts of his algorithm. With her own sharp analytical mind, a mind that had been dormant for 10 years, she began to understand the genius of his work. And just as Nathaniel had predicted, tucked away in a seemingly innocuous leather-bound diary, she found it notes on a Project Chimera, a second-generation algorithm that was exponentially more powerful and elegant than the one Damien had stolen. As she worked, a new sense of purpose began to replace her grief. This was her fight now. Not just for herself, but for her father's legacy. She wasn't just a victim. She was the custodian of his genius. Meanwhile, the war with Damien had begun. He had discovered her destination within 48 hours. His reach was long, his resources vast. But Nathaniel had anticipated this. The villa was secure, and a team of top-tier international security consultants ensured their privacy. Unable to reach her directly, Damien unleashed his fury through the press. A new wave of stories appeared painting Isabella as an unstable gold-digging wife who had suffered a mental breakdown after a routine surgery and fled with a known business rival. Anonymous sources close to Blackwood spoke of her erratic behavior and lavish spending. They twisted her love of art into an obsession, her quiet nature into reclusiveness. He was systematically assassinating her character, painting himself as the wronged, benevolent husband worried sick about his fragile wife. "He's trying to discredit you before you can discredit him," Nathaniel explained one evening as they sat on the terrace, a chessboard between them. The sky was streaked with purple and gold. "It's a classic preemptive strike. If he can convince the world you're crazy, nothing you say will have any credibility." "Will it work?" Isabella asked, her voice quiet. "People believe what they want to believe," he replied, moving his knight. "But truth has a way of cutting through the noise, especially when it's backed by evidence. Your father's journals are the truth." Checkmate. Their evenings often ended like this, with quiet conversation or a game of chess. She was beginning to see the man behind the rescuer. Nathaniel was brilliant, fiercely intelligent, but also possessed a deep well of kindness. He spoke of his own battles with Damien, of the predatory business practices and the lives that had been ruined. His fight was not just business, it was personal, ideological. He believed in building things, Damien in conquering them. A team of patent lawyers hired by Nathaniel began working with Isabella via encrypted video calls. They were cautiously optimistic. The journals, combined with a forensic analysis of Blackwood Global's source code, could build a powerful case for intellectual property theft. But the fight took a new, more sinister turn. One day, a formal-looking letter arrived via a Swiss courier. It was from Damien's legal team. It was a divorce settlement offer. An incredibly generous one. Tens of millions of dollars, properties, a lifetime annuity. It would set her up for life, allowing her to live in unimaginable luxury forever. But it came with one non-negotiable condition, a permanent, unbreakable non-disclosure agreement about Damien, his business, and their life together, and she would have to turn over all of her father's research materials. It was a bribe wrapped in a legal threat. He was trying to buy her silence. He was trying to buy her father's legacy, the very thing she was fighting to reclaim. "He knows," Isabella said, her hands trembling as she held the letter. "He knows that we have the journals. He's scared." "He is," Nathaniel agreed, his expression grim. "This is his way of testing your resolve. He still thinks he can buy you, that you're the same woman he married, the one who would trade anything for a life of comfort." Isabella looked from the letter to the stack of her father's journals on the table. In that moment, the last vestiges of the timid, compliant wife Damien had created burned away. He wasn't offering her a future. He was offering her another cage, albeit a more comfortable one. She walked over to the fireplace, the legal document still in her hand. Without a moment's hesitation, she tossed it into the flames. They both watched as the thick, creamy paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The words "Damien Blackwood" were the last to be consumed by the fire. "Tell the lawyers to file the lawsuit," she said, turning to face Nathaniel, her eyes clear and resolute. "I don't want his money. I want justice." The lawsuit landed like a bombshell. Rossi v. Blackwood Global became the headline that finally eclipsed the salacious gossip. The filing was a masterpiece of legal strategy, a precise and damning document that accused Damien Blackwood not only of intellectual property theft on a massive scale, but also detailed a decade of fraud and manipulation. It laid bare the truth of their marriage, reframing it as the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar crime. The world was stunned. The narrative Damien had so carefully crafted of the benevolent husband and his unstable wife was instantly shattered. Isabella was no longer a madwoman. She was a potential giant slayer. The case became the talk of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and every major news outlet. Blackwood Global's stock, once considered untouchable, began to tremble. Damien's response was swift and vicious. He countersued for defamation, his lawyers releasing a flood of fabricated evidence, doctored emails, paid witnesses, who spoke of her instability and even confidential psychiatric evaluations from years prior that Damien had coerced her into attending with a therapist on his payroll. He was trying to drown the truth in a sea of lies. But Isabella was no longer the fragile woman who had woken up alone in a hospital bed. The months in Lake Como, fortified by Nathaniel's quiet support and fueled by the rediscovery of her own intellect, had forged her into someone new. She had spent countless hours with the legal team not as a passive client, but as an active partner. Her intimate knowledge of her father's work and her decade of observing Damien's methods made her their most valuable asset. She decided to take the fight one step further. Against the advice of her more cautious lawyers, she agreed to a single exclusive interview with Evelyn Reed, a renowned journalist known for her tough, incisive style. The interview took place not in a sterile studio but in the library of the Lake Como villa, surrounded by her father's books and journals. Isabella, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, was the picture of composure and strength. She was not the hysterical woman Damien's PR machine had portrayed. She was articulate, intelligent, and unflinching. She didn't sling mud. She simply told the truth. She spoke of her love for her father, of her own abandoned ambitions, and of the slow, insidious nature of Damien's control. She walked Evelyn Reed through her father's notebooks, explaining the complex science with a clarity that made it accessible to everyone. She laid out the timeline of her marriage and the rise of Blackwood Global, connecting the dots with irrefutable precision. Mr. Blackwood didn't just steal a company's technology, Isabella said, looking directly into the camera, her voice steady and clear. He stole a man's legacy, and he did it by preying on his grieving daughter. He tried to erase my father, and then he tried to erase me. This lawsuit isn't about money. I want none of his money. This is about reclaiming a name, my father's, Alistair Rossi, and my own. The interview was a global phenomenon. It was watched by millions. Her quiet dignity and undeniable intelligence resonated far more than Damien's loud, aggressive denials. Public opinion, once swayed by his power, began to turn decisively in her favor. Support poured in from unexpected places. Former employees of Blackwood Global came forward with their own stories of Damien's unethical behavior. A retired professor who had known her father confirmed the nature of his research. The legal pressure mounted. The discovery process unearthed damning evidence. Forensics proved that the initial code for Damien's flagship product was a direct lift from files found on her father's old hard drives. The walls were closing in. The end for Damien came not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a quiet capitulation. Facing a shareholder revolt and a federal investigation prompted by the lawsuit's revelations, he was forced out as CEO of his own company. The board, desperate to save the corporation, settled with Isabella out of court. The settlement was historic. It wasn't about a payout. The core demands were public. Blackwood Global was forced to issue a formal public apology and officially credit Alistair Rossi as the foundational inventor of their core technology. They established a multi-million-dollar grant in his name for young innovators. And Damien Blackwood, under the terms of his severance, was bound by an NDA so restrictive he could never publicly speak of the case or Isabella again. He was silenced, erased from his own story. Months later, Isabella stood on the balcony of the villa in Lake Como. In her hand was not a legal document, but the charter for a new foundation she had created with Nathaniel's help, the Rossi Foundation, dedicated to funding the arts and sciences, the two passions of her father's life. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, handing her a glass of champagne. Their relationship had evolved slowly, naturally, from protector and protected to partners. He had never tried to save her, only to empower her to save herself. "To the Phoenix," he said, raising his glass. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a calm confidence. "I'm not a phoenix," she corrected him gently. "A phoenix is reborn from ashes. But I was never destroyed. I was just buried. And I finally dug my way out." She looked out at the shimmering lake, the future as vast and beautiful as the horizon. She had lost a decade of her life to a lie, but in fighting back she had found something far more valuable herself. She had reclaimed her past, and in doing so, had built her own future, one that belonged to no one but her. The war was over, and Isabella Rossi had won. Isabella's story is a powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals often come from those we trust the most. It's a journey from a gilded cage of silent despair to a triumphant flight into freedom. She was abandoned at her weakest moment, stripped of her identity and her resources, but she refused to be a victim. Instead, she unearthed the truth, reclaimed her father's legacy, and discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Her victory wasn't just in a courtroom. It was in the moment she chose to fight, the moment she chose herself. What did you find most powerful about Isabella's transformation? Have you ever witnessed someone rise from the ashes of betrayal stronger than before? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of resilience and justice resonated with you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of overcoming the impossible. Your support helps us continue to share these incredible journeys.